Hi, welcome, Harper. I am a family friend who has known you since birth, and I am interested in AI. I like to say that I know a little bit more than the average bear just because we have two sons in tech, but I don't know too much, and you are in that world. So why don't you introduce yourself and then we'll just jump into the conversation. We had lunch for the people who are viewing this. We had lunch and Harper was so fantastic at explaining some of this stuff. So we're going to go over some of the stuff that we talked about at lunch.
Thank you. Well, hi, I'm Harper. I'm head of AI ML at Brev.dev, and I got my undergrad and my master's in machine learning from Stanford, so AI, computer science. I was at Meta for 4 years doing machine learning. I was on newsfeed ranking and on civic intelligence, and global intelligence um, for many years. And now I'm head of AI ML at Brev.dev.
So you certainly have a great background. And something that we talked about before is when you talk about being on civic intelligence for Meta, which it owns both Facebook and Instagram, or is the parent company. I think that's for people don't realize that the impact of understanding misinformation in other countries is so significant, perhaps even more so than in our country. So can you explain that?
Yeah, I think in terms of detecting misinformation, I mean, you have to hire people there who are reading the content and speak the language and understand that it has misinformation in it. The models that read this content are inherently not as good as English because English has a lot of resources, meaning there's a lot of content that we can train the model on. But for languages that have a little bit fewer resources, the models are not as functional as the ones in English. So they have some outsized harm.
So one of the things that we talked about before is that ironically, because you were working before the introduction of AI at the level that it's at, but AI, the large language models, which are the current is currently what's out there, will be much more fluent in all these languages. So if you train them properly to know what misinformation might be, and if you say it in English, it will know in Urdu or something.
Yeah. Well, misinformation itself is a hard thing to do with just a model. Like Meta uses third-party fact checkers, as in real people, to read the content. But what I was working on was an actor-based system that looked at behavior of a person to see if perhaps they were spreading or have malicious intent on the site or to harm people, and then going in and analyzing that content.
So that gets to the very first and most important question. Is it important for what I would say normal people, lay people, to understand AI, and to what degree do we have to understand it, and why? Because there's an awful lot of technology. I have no idea how a jet engine works, but I take lots of airplane flights.
I think there are some things that are important for people to know, like the fact that models hallucinate, and so to not just take everything it says at face value, validate the output that it gives. And
okay, I want to stop for a second because hallucinate, I know what it means, but that's like basically the model just makes stuff up.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's this famous case with Avianca Airlines where somebody was sitting in the aisle of a flight and the beverage cart hit him, and he sued Avianca Airlines, and the lawyer he hired used AI, and the AI came back with cases and quotes and judges' names. And so the Avianca lawyers went to look up all of these cases And it turned out they absolutely didn't exist. They were cases assigned to, I don't know, salmonella or some car theft or something, having absolutely nothing to do. And AI didn't say, sorry, I can't find anything relevant. It just spewed out stuff that looked right,
Yeah.
but actually was a hallucination, as you call it,
Yeah.
or as the industry calls it.
Yeah, hallucinations are pretty common right now. The models are trained to understand the distribution of um, the training data that it receives, so the distribution of words, and it may make things up if it believes that, like, it doesn't have an inherent understanding of fact versus fiction necessarily. I mean, there are methods now that are used on top of just plain, models like RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation, where it's actually meant to grab specific info and reference specific information as it's outputting information. But, a model that's just kind of a word generator, it can make things
I
up.
think in the Avianca Airlines, the lawyer who used the AI asked the AI, is this real information? And the AI said yes. It was sort of like a kid with his hand in the cookie jar. I mean, the AI just knew it was a better idea to say yes than say no, I just made it up.
Right. Well, if again, it's looking at data from the internet, and so it's looking at, for example, in a chat-based system, it's looking at its training data, which probably, when you ask in training data, if you're gathering lots of chats with, certain assistants in the training data, when someone said, "Is this real?" the assistant probably said yes. And so the most likely word based on its training data of "is this real" might be yes, unless it has, some kind of like.
So this is the example that we've talked about before. So large language models, my very primitive understanding is that the AI is trained on all this information that's on the internet. Okay, it's just digested billions of bits of information. And it knows that if you have a sentence that says, I'm taking off my jacket because the weather is, it knows that the next likely word is going to be hot.
Yeah.
It's not going to be chocolate, even though it reads hot.
The weather is.
Yeah, the weather is, or cold, or whatever.
Yeah.
Because it knows the jacket, well, something less about temperature. Oh, because it's hot. I guess the example we use is, I'm taking off my jacket because it's hot, and it knows the next word is going to be weather, not potato.
Yeah.
Hot potato is something that's commonly written together, but it knows that more often if the word jacket is in the sentence,
right,
weather's going to be in the sentence as opposed to potato.
Right. And as it has these longer attention windows and context windows, it's able to go back and look further back in sentences and reference that. So it has this large context rather than, just a random word generator, which, generates a new word based on the one before it. Like, as these models get more complex, it has longer attention windows, and it is able.
So let's talk about the data that it trains on, because this is what the actors' strike was about. This was the writers' strike in Hollywood. It trained, for example, well, Hemingway is dead, but it could read the works of Hemingway, and it could generate a new Hemingway-esque novel.
Yeah.
But it can also, for living authors like James Patterson, who, comes out with a book every year, he may never write another book again because his publisher may just say to AI, read all the James Patterson books and give me a new one.
Yeah.
And it is trained on this, and James Patterson gets no royalties.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing about Tom Cruise and the Mission Impossible. If you look at all the Mission Impossible, the kind of character, CGI, computer generated images, can create a Tom Cruise lookalike, and artificial intelligence can write the Mission Impossible. You don't need a script writer.
Right.
So that's what they were striking about. You're training on our work, but we're not getting any royalties.
Right. Yeah, and I think this is like an ethics question. And I mean, I think that they should get royalties, but then it becomes a broader question of, you know, these models are based on everything on the internet, and you can't pay everyone, like maybe there are royalties in some cases, but in the sense of, art, there's a lot of question around these art generation models. And wow, this piece of art really looks similar to my piece of art. It must have been trained on my piece of art. Well, yes, it was on the internet. And I mean, how do we as humans get inspired? We're inspired by things around us. Our language, our writing is based on everything we've ever seen before or read before. And so nothing is truly unique in that sense. And I think that's kind of the view I take as well with these models, with these generative models, because yeah, they're basing new original output on what they've seen before, but so are we.
Well, that's always a question about copyright. How close, how identical, what's copyright, what's plagiarism?
Right. I mean, in school, right, what did we do? We read a sentence and then switched a couple words around, and then that wasn't plagiarism anymore. And I mean, this isn't going to be much different. But it has a vast, it's going to be based on many more pieces of data than us as kids in middle school reading one journal article and then basically changing the words around,
So getting back to the hallucinations, California and New Jersey now have laws that say school children need to be taught how to determine the information that they're reading on the internet. What is the original source? Now, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure if they would recognize what the original source, if it says it comes from Americans for Better Life organization.
Yeah.
Is that a legitimate organization,
right,
or is that actually something hokey with a particular bias?
But we always had to do that in school too.
Well, that's right. But
yeah.
but if we relied on Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, that was just in our minds objective. And I think a lot of school children rely on Wikipedia because it has so many editors for every piece of information. But if something comes from, or if it's a bill and it comes from Congress, then you know that's. But if it comes from an organization, you don't actually know what that organization's bias might be. Is that actually fact?
Yeah.
But it's nevertheless, it's a start for them to work backwards. Don't just take everything at face value.
Yeah. Well, I was taught that in school as well. We couldn't use Wikipedia and we couldn't use just random websites. They had to be, really established websites, journals, academic journals, papers, things like that. And there are some language models that actually do reference journals and where they came from. Like there's this one, view.com, where you can search for things or ask it a question, kind of like ChatGPT, and then say, where is your source? And then it will point you to a source. So there are some models around this, and OpenAI is improving. They're all just rapidly advancing really quickly.
Okay, so on the subject of rapidly advancing, so there are the accelerators, which that's not the technical term anymore. The people who want AI to develop as quickly as possible, and for us to be first in the world, and the decelerators. So talk about that schism in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, the decelerationist, or decels as they're referred to in a derogative way on X, they're just people who bring up concerns about the risk that AI might have down the line. And I think it's valid. I mean, with any kind of any kind of risk analysis, you have this distribution, and at the tail, there's this thing called tail risk, where at the very end, there's a lot of risk there, and it's not super likely, but it could happen, and it's high risk.
Or that's where the Powerball winner is. That,
Yeah.
that very unlikely, but somebody does ultimately win the Powerball. And
That's
in a
different.
negative way,
That's different.
in this case,
Yeah.
the odds might be against it, but there is that infinitesimal,
Yeah.
or maybe not infinitesimal,
This is
in
slightly
some
different
people's
than the
mind.
Powerball because someone is going to win every time, right? Or something like that.
No.
I actually don't really know how it works, but someone doesn't win every time?
No, not at all.
Oh, okay.
It just keeps going, but the odds keep getting greater because
Okay.
the larger the jackpot, more people. But
Yeah.
in theory, eventually, someone will win. But
Right. Right.
it can be 6 months.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, as technology continues to advance, we, are testing that likelihood more and more, and maybe it becomes more and more likely. But I think we'll be able to steer the ship away from it as we get to that. But I think it is important to consider that there is tail risk.
Well, let's talk about the paperclip because that's a
yeah.
very famous example. So yeah.
So effective altruism is a school of thought, or these people who think about risks to humanity and to life and trying to make the world a better place, I guess. And one of their things is that they worry about extinction risk, and they use this example of a paperclip. So if you have a machine and you've trained it to make paper clips, is it going to actually know not to harm humans or the world in this process, or is it going to do everything it can to make as many paper clips as possible, which might include wiping out the human race to use the resources that we need for paper clips? And it's kind of like, the Disney Fantasia, where Disney has the Mickey has the broom, and he trains it. He takes a spell from a magician and doesn't really know how to use it, but has the broom clean up for him this water, and it ends up just getting completely out of control, and he doesn't know how to stop it, and he's drowning in this water from this automated system that he's made. So that's what the paperclip thing is.
Yeah, so those people are the doomers
or decels are the people who just, let's slow it down, let's have checks and balances. And I mean, I really do, I see both sides. I think the risk is small, especially right now, as we don't have it. And personally, I would say I think the risk is small right now, as long as we don't move it into having robots and,
Well, the risk may be small now. The problem is, it may grow, and at that point, we no longer can control it. So, so this gets into the subject of governance.
Yeah.
That it's a very controlled, little monster until one day exponentially it's a very large monster.
Yeah.
And out of our control, beyond our capability.
Yeah, the stance I took from it was, I used to take from it with this situation, is that I didn't think that there really was an extinction risk. Some people are coming out, like Geoffrey Hinton and Ilya Sutskever, who, are two really huge pioneers of AI. They, think that extinction risk is plausible and should be really considered. And I actually agree, but they kind of take a stronger stance on it, especially Geoffrey Hinton.
So he quit Google.
Yeah.
And this fellow Ilya was the person who started the dominoes that Sam Altman was fired from OpenAI, and now has been reinstated. But without getting into the politics of OpenAI, although we should talk about their structure, these are two giants in the field who have really pioneered this whole era.
Right.
And they are taking a very strong stance, slow down.
Yes, but there are also really big pioneers like Andrew Ng, who, and Jan LeCun, who's at Meta. Andrew Ng is big at Stanford, and I forget what company he's at with now, but he's also huge. They take the opposite side. They think that it's ridiculous. So I am not one of these big players. I don't pretend to know nearly as much as they do. And I mean, these are truly pioneers who have spent so much of their lives making huge advancements into this field. So I kind of defer to them. But I'm not someone, some people I see calling Ilya or Geoffrey decels. And I mean, I'm sorry, but Ilya and Geoffrey just know much more than you do, most likely, most of these people have just entered AI. So I think we should give them the respect and listen to them without just writing them off.
So I want to talk to you about the data that these models train on.
Yeah.
First of all, what if, let's just use Russia as an example. It's in their interest to disrupt our society.
Yeah.
Let's just assume that's a given assumption. So what if they flood the internet with lots of divisive and misinformation? How do these large language models, which are just reading everything and looking at probability,
Yeah.
to the extent that there's more and more information that comes up that it's reading that happens to be wrong?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the other aspect is not only deliberate bad actors, but what about the biases that are just built in that we don't even realize?
Definitely. That's a great question. So there's a few things with this. Yes, if the model is trained on false data that is either intentionally false or maliciously false, that's what it's going to reflect, like, period. And it's going to have a hard time knowing that that's false because that's what it is trained on, and that's what it takes to be fact, unless you teach it this is wrong and then have an output. So there are some ways to combat this. One of them is, just making sure your data set is really clean, which can, hard to do with these massive models that just scrape the internet. Something that OpenAI is using is reinforcement learning with human feedback, where the humans are interacting with the model and kind of teaching it to reference teaching it responses that are good and responses that are bad, and then training it to kind of refer to, types of thinking that are validated by the humans. So, for example, if it has an output, if it has one school of thought that's, from some random web page, and one school of thought that is, from a scientific paper, the human will help it kind of just refer to the scientific paper school of thought in this more advanced. I won't get into it too much because we don't have much time, but that's one way of helping it prune these negative, misinformation bits that it has. However, that takes a long time to have the human cover all those pieces and to find all those sources of misinformation. So I believe in smaller models, and I think that that's where the future is going to be. I mean, we have some of these behemoth models, Llama, which is Meta's model, we have ChatGPT, we have Mistral, these models that are trained on all of the internet. But I think the future is small, specialized models where people have a small amount of data, they've cleaned it, they know it's really pure, they know that it works well and on the tasks that they need. And so they're going to fine tune, I guess, a bigger model on this small specific task with this specialized data. And so the model will heavily reference this fine tuning and will behave in the way that it's taught to behave. And so it has this base understanding of the world from these big models, but then it's trained on this really specific, really clean data. And
so just as an example, is this for, let's just use medical, diagnoses.
Yeah.
Is this how the medical profession or the legal profession, they would have models that were specifically trained on really only legal, knowing nothing about climate change, but only knowing legal cases?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess, so yeah, if you wanted to build a model like from scratch, not knowing anything about climate change, you could do that. I think a lot of cases that I see right now would be taking a larger model trained on the internet, so probably knowing a little bit about climate change, but then having it really heavily emphasize this new medical data. And that doesn't take very long to do. It's not very expensive. You could train it on a relatively small amount of data, but have it really heavily indexed on this new information.
So that's a very important point about that it's not very expensive to do, because OpenAI was started as a nonprofit.
Yeah.
But somehow it now has a profit arm that became the tail wagging the dog. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. I sadly do have to go very soon, but I would want to talk about this. So OpenAI, basically, they were a nonprofit, and they were founded with the idea of having open AI, open source, sharing their code, and making sure that the models were safe for humanity. However, after a period of time, they had trouble relying only on donations, and so they decided to open a profit branch of the company that was under the nonprofit branch and was supposed to abide by the mission statement of the nonprofit, which is delivering safe AI to humanity. But
With
this
transparency.
yeah, I don't know where the transparency got lost in the mission statement, but they are, they're not open source anymore. Their models are closed and paid for. But they say that that's, it's expensive to train these models, to pay for the talent. So yeah, was their reasoning about opening the profit branch.
So just a few more minutes.
Yeah.
What is a utopian? A doomer point of view is, the general intelligence. When AI becomes smarter than we are, and that's artificial general intelligence.
Yeah.
That's not the large language model where it can do creative things.
Mm-hmm.
It might decide, that's the paperclip story, that it might decide human beings are in the way of making maximum amount of paper clips. What is the utopian point of view?
I mean, that AI could change everything. I mean, it could transform medicine. It could, cure people of illnesses because we have this massive.
How does the utopian point of view, let me be a little more specific. How does the utopian point of view work when so many people's jobs are impacted?
I think people will learn how to use the new tool. I think, right, it will be used in every industry, and I think people will adapt. I think as tools come out, people always believe that they would take their jobs, as more machinery comes out. But I think, yeah, maybe some jobs might become less human dense, but others won't be. And
human dense. I like that. Well, one of my sons, they're both in tech, one of my sons says, well, it'll just, if it's really working at its best capacity, its best case scenario, it can make many aspects of what our costs of living.
right.
It can distribute food more efficiently.
Gosh, yeah.
Grow food. It can build robotics. It can
Optimize everything.
right.
Just truly optimize everything. We can't even imagine what life is going to look like after this.
It can desalinate water. It can whatever. And in that way, because from my point of view, I just see mass unemployment and bread lines and what have you.
Might turn that all around. Yeah, I think taking an optimistic view is important because this technology is really unlike anything we've ever had before, and it's really an exciting time.
So that's the final thing. I mean, this whole technology at the moment is being created and controlled by a small group of people, really basically out of Silicon Valley.
But this is where I really care about open source, and I'm a big pioneer of open source, which is why I'm at Brev. There are open source models that outperform ChatGPT 3.5. So the GPT 3.5, so the free version of ChatGPT, there are models that are open source available for anyone to download that work better than that. And people can fine tune them really cheaply. I have a model that talks like my teenage self, and it's trained on less than 200 of my journal entries. And I spent, less than $1 training this model, and now I can run it as many times as I want. Like, we can have these specialized models, and it's really exciting. It doesn't have to be controlled by this small group. Open source is, I think, the future, and having these small specialized models that are relatively cheap to train.
Yeah, I mean, because that invites the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
It invites other cultures who have other.
Exactly. I have people inboxing me asking about training models on their language that there isn't much data for it, and it's just so exciting. You can really fine tune a model for anything, and I'm just so excited about where the future is going. So, well, thank you. I hope this has been educational for whomever is watching this. Yeah. It's certainly educational for me. Thanks for having me. I was a great interviewer. Thank you.